as much as we can talk about the Republican Party, like, undermining democracy by not conceding, I think what the Democrats did in this midterm election with the funding of MAGA candidates, I think in a way that can be construed as an undermining of democracy as well.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Mainstream Media Podcast, hosted here at Raw News, King's College London's student newspaper. Today, we look at the fallout from Tuesday's midterms in the US. In part one, we lay out the context of what was expected, what actually happened, and what this means for America going forward. In part two, we invite partisans on to debate the issues of the campaign, including abortion, Trump, and the state of democracy. I'm Fintan Hogan, comment editor here at Raw, and we hope you enjoy this episode of Mainstream Media.
Fintan, let me avoid the question. Let me avoid the question.
Their best politician is a previous president.
I mean, half the Conservative Party forgot what Johnson did in about 6 weeks.
Pfizer was basically begging the government to buy vaccines.
You're a paleo-conservative prophet.
Is democracy under genuine threat in Brazil?
Fade away into neoliberal nothingness.
Frankly, there's a good chance that he's going to be kicked out of the House of Commons.
Way back on the gravy train. That's not going to happen.
They are actively trying to undermine the Democratic decision that was made in 2020.
We're here for part one of the podcast, and I've got two excellent Raw members here with me. First, we've got Emma, our news editor. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Emma. I'm one of the news editors for the Raw section. I'm a third-year history and political economy student, and I'm British American, so I grew up in California.
We've got Ben, who some of you might remember from our first podcast, back for us again.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a staff writer here at Raw, and I'm a first-year history and political economy student.
So we thought we'd start the podcast with maybe less partisan voices to really explain to you what has happened, because there's been a lot of, it's still a developing story, and we'd like to update you with where the state of play is as we're recording this episode. So on Tuesday, we're recording on Friday lunchtime. On Tuesday, the US elections for the 188th Congress were held in the United States. There were 35 Senate seats and all 435 House seats up for grabs for the two main parties. There were also 6 abortion referendums across the states, as well as 36 state governorships and down-ballot votes on secretaries of state, state treasurers, and state legislatures as well. So it's important that we bear in mind that it's not just a midterm election of just the Senate or just the House. It's in this wider context as well. I'd like to start, before we invite you two of you to tell us a bit more about what you think has happened and what it means, I'd like to start from day -1 of the election, so the day before, and what people were expecting, because I think I've had discussions definitely with Ben and in passing with Emma that we thought the election results would look slightly different to what they do now. Yeah? Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the phrase of the day was the words red wave, and that's what everyone was expecting, this sort of huge victory for the Republicans. I mean, this is very normal. During a midterms, presidents normally get a bit of a backlash, and of course, so the incumbent party, which is the Democrats, were expecting to be hit hard, especially with I think it's like 7.7% inflation. It wasn't looking good, and so the Republicans have definitely won this election. But
well, I have a few stats actually. So according to a quick Google search, it was 8.5% inflation. I don't know what metric that is, as well as there's been some hike of gas prices recently, which tends to be important for American elections.
Huge.
Biden is on a 54 to 41 approve rating, so he's in the low 40s approval as the presidency. This generally signals a very bad midterm election. These are similar to numbers that Trump had in 2018 when I think they lost about 40 seats to the Democrats. Voters in midterm elections tend to exhibit what's called buyer's regret, because whichever party that gets swung towards the presidency tends to swing back the other way 2 years later. And since 1994, the president's party has normally lost the House popular vote by 6 to 9%. And 2010 for Obama, so the most applicable one for Biden, because he was obviously vice president, there was a 17% drop on the presidential popular vote for Obama just 2 years later. So in the context of all of this, it looks like the results didn't go the way we expected. Emma, how are the results looking now?
Yeah, I mean, I believe another thing that's been quoted a lot since Tuesday has been the red ripple rather than a red wave. And like you were talking about, right now, this is pretty much historically unprecedented. Biden is at 41% approval rating, which is similar both to Obama, but also you look at Clinton, you look at Bush, most of their approval ratings were in the low 40s during their midterms. Same thing happened where there's usually a huge swing in the other direction. So this is one of the first times, if not the first time, I think, that you've ever seen such a small swing. Of course, it's not over yet, but it's clear that there's not going to be a vast majority in either of the houses. And that's very unprecedented.
Yeah, we have to say at the moment that the Senate is balanced 48-48. The Republicans have lost Pennsylvania to the Democrats. And the House is currently, according to the Guardian's website at this time, 192 for the Democrats, which is a loss of 9, and 211 for the Republicans, which is a win of 7. So the Republicans do look on track to take the House, but the Senate is still up in the air. There's 3 uncalled races in the Senate, more or less, because Wisconsin has gone for the Republicans, Georgia has gone to a runoff, and we're waiting for Nevada and Arizona are the 2 yet undeclared results. But no matter what happens, this has been unexpected. 538, the polling compilation organisation, had said there was a 57% chance of the Republicans winning both houses, both chambers of Congress in the midterms, and only 27% chance that they would just win the House and not the Senate. But we look on track for that, actually. This is the best midterms for a president since 1950.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, Biden's pretty hyped right now.
Yeah, unprecedented. You were right, Emma.
Yeah.
What do you think was the worst night of all of the Republicans who really, really underperformed?
I think I would put... I don't know if I would necessarily say this was the worst specifically, but I think Pennsylvania is quite important to look at, because obviously the Republican running mate was Dr. Oz.
Yep.
Celebrity doctor in the U.S., very well known, and very highly endorsed by Donald Trump as well. So his opponent, John Fetterman, he suffered a stroke in May. He has been the subject of a huge Republican smear campaign. And he still pulled through in what's historically been quite a conservative, sometimes Democrat, but a relatively conservative state. That was pretty unexpected, I think, mainly because of just how hard the Republicans have been attacking.
And it was how early the race was called. It was
exactly, yeah.
The same night they managed to call it for the Democrats. Ben, who do you think had the worst night?
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think, yeah. There is a sort of, if you watch his speech, there's a massive disconnect between the words that he is saying and his body language while saying them. So,
but Ben, Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot. How has he had a bad night?
Well, he's had a bad night because his endorsed candidates, these so-called sort of MAGA Republicans, have really underperformed. Of course, Dr. Oz is sort of the most well-known example of that. He's also had a really bad night because of this sort of growth of his sort of nearest rival, Ron DeSantis, who I think we're going on to soon. Obviously had a very, very good night and has placed himself to be potentially the next Republican candidate.
Yeah, he styled himself up to be the heir to Trump.
Yeah,
we're going to ask a little bit later with our partisans a bit more about who's to blame for such a big loss and what the underlying political factors were, but feel free to touch on these briefly. But who really, if the Senate turns out maybe 50-50, maybe 51-49, and the House has a small Republican majority, Emma, who really holds the keys to the castle? Who's in power?
So this is the thing, is there's been a big emphasis on the fact that this has not been a major Republican win, the way that a lot of people thought it was. But I don't think that necessarily means that Republicans are going to be more moderated, because you still have some of the biggest Republican donors are still Trump-endorsed candidates. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a big one there. She draws in a lot of money for the party. So you're still putting power into the hands of a party which has, for the past 8 years or so, been very defined by Trump and by his agenda. And I mean, this is another unprecedented part about this midterms, is you have the previous president is such a big focus here. I mean, when, after Obama finished his 2 terms, he wasn't necessarily on the ticket.
Yeah.
Same thing goes for pretty much any sitting president that you look at in the past.
It's the first one-term president.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
This is one of the biggest changes, I think, in this election specifically, is you have Democrats running against Trump still, even though he's not on the ballot.
The interesting analysis I saw of it is that normally a midterm election, as we've said, is a referendum on the sitting president, and normally a sitting president falls pretty badly in a referendum.
This is the sitting president versus the previous president.
I would argue that this is the sitting president against the previous president and against the Supreme Court. Why is that, Ben? Why is the Supreme Court weighing into this?
Well, because I think we've effectively seen 2 different elections. Sort of 50-50. Half of voters have been voting on lines of sort of inflation or the economy, whereas the other half of voters have been voting on sort of freedoms. And of course, the Dobbs case of June has an incredible impact on this, and an incredible way.
That's of course what I was referring to, the Dobbs case that overturned the Roe v. Wade ruling, which protected abortion rights for American women.
This has mobilised, especially a youthful Democrat vote, like we've never seen before, really. And there's been a huge sort of disconnect between the conversations, where a lot of Republicans have been campaigning on this inflation and the economy and law and order, and Democrats, for the first time in a while, have been able to say, we are now the party of freedoms, and we will protect these freedoms, with abortion being the main one there. And so that has arguably been the biggest factor in this sort of Democrat resurgence. A few months ago, they were really in trouble.
Yeah, so this has been a big part of most of the analysis that I've seen this week, is two of the biggest deciding parts of this election have been abortion rights and democracy. Mm-hmm. So these are sort of the 2 points that have been very emphasized in most analysis, where the areas where you have Democratic voters turn out the most has been in states where you have abortion rights, which could potentially come under attack, and states where you have a lot of these Trump-endorsed candidates who are saying that they don't support the 2020 election results. Very direct threats to American democracy. And it's interesting because if you look actually where Democrats have not done very well, it's most of these states where abortion rights are more protected. It's places where they don't feel like they need to turn out as much. The biggest waves have been states which have abortions on their ballots.
Yeah, I was going to say this actually. This is a point that I picked up from some of the reporting from the New York Times. The
Times has been big on this, yeah.
Exactly. There might have been a denationalisation of politics in the last year. We obviously think that Trump is such an overriding, animating factor for all sides, but maybe we're seeing a swing against that. So the examples that they gave in some of their reporting was that in Michigan, where abortion was on the ballot, the Republicans were down on Trump-Biden. In Pennsylvania, where the Republicans had promoted a Stop the Steal candidate, this speaks more directly to what Joe Biden was saying before, that democracy is on the ballot. Whether or not we think that actually democracy is on the ballot, the Republicans have presented a radical candidate, and then in Pennsylvania, the Democrats were up on Biden. Whereas in New York, just across the border, abortion was safe. It's a relatively liberal country. There's no real threats to abortion access, at least not in the immediate term. And there's a huge swing away from the Democrats.
It looks like most of the major contested counties in New York are going Republican.
Yeah, I was seeing some of the analysis that The Guardian was doing that I referenced earlier, and some of the lean Democrat seats, which were expected to be in the maybe 40% chance of Republicans, have actually been taken, especially in upstate New York, where I think one of our debaters later on has come from. So hopefully she can tell us some more about that. And the one last interesting point that I found was that in Virginia is a state which has only midterms, so there's no down ballot races. So they're just looking at, I'm not sure if there was a Senate race, but there were definitely House races. And there was an expected swing on what we would normally see, what Ben was mentioning at the start, that Republicans and Democrats, no matter who the president is, there's normally a downswing of 6 to 9 points in a midterm election. That's exactly what we saw in this state, where there was no Republican anti-democratic candidates, there was no threat to abortion, and it was just a bog standard midterm. We saw the exact expected swing. So my question for both of you is, have the Republicans shot themselves in the foot with the themes that have been brought forward in this election?
I think you can definitely see that a little bit. I mean, already you have a lot of the GOP is blaming Donald Trump for these exact results. I think that it's interesting. Virginia is a good case to bring up, actually, because the thing about Virginia is they do off-year governor elections, I think I'm right in saying. Mm-hmm. And it's right where they didn't have any major abortion rights on the ballot. They didn't necessarily have very hardline Trumpist candidates. So that's why they have done pretty much exactly as expected. So I think in asking if the Republicans have shot themselves in the foot a bit here, I think you can say the Trumpist side of the Republican Party has. And I think that that's going to become more and more apparent in the coming weeks when you actually see Congress going into session and trying to make rulings.
counterintuitively, going back to our last point, we suggested that if the Republicans win only a narrow majority in the House of Representatives, this may give the extreme voices more power because they're the fundraising potential. Do you think that maybe this is a bad night for Trump, but it might not be the worst 2 years, Ben?
Well, yeah, I think this is. I think we should still be able to, and no one's really saying this. The Republicans, I think we can still say, won this election. They didn't win it by as much as we thought they would, but they did still win it. And I think one major shift now is that on a lot of these climate agenda issues, on Biden's economic policies, he had to deal with moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin. Now we'll have to deal with the Freedom Caucus. And so we could be seeing, I mean, there's something amazing stat, like only 4% of bills get through a Congress, which has divided power. And so we now are going to be seeing hugely watered down bills and potentially a lot of gridlock. So I think that...
Yeah, we're expecting gridlock, maybe another government shutdown or threats of such?
Yes. Now, the big thing that's coming up soon is the debt ceiling. And the Republicans, that's now going to have to be passed in both houses. And the Republicans will be able to have a lot of leverage, basically force a lot of budget cuts, and in order to sort of allow the debt ceiling to go up. The debt ceiling has to go up, or else the whole American economic system effectively fails. That is now a lot of political power in the hands of Republicans and in the hands of MAGA Republicans as well.
I think I would say here, though, that one trend which I think is interesting to look at is the fact that there's been a lot of ticket splitting in this election. So what that means is, like, you're right, for a long time it's been assumed that American politics has gone towards a more national side. So something that happens in one place you can expect to happen quite similarly in another place. What we've seen in this election is people coming out maybe to vote for a Republican member of Congress, but a Democrat governor, or I think it's probably more likely vice versa. But this is a trend which you haven't actually seen very much in the last 20 years or so. You've seen people voting a lot along party lines, and that's been a big change, which I think could show up in future elections as well. I think if people are more willing to split their ticket now and to say that what matters more to me is less what exactly whether the party is in power, but more about the people from the party who are in power, I think that can cause quite a big shift in the Republican Party.
So maybe bipartisanship isn't quite dead, moderates are back on the table.
I would say that it's definitely true Republicans have won this election. I think it is going to give power to the extreme side of the party, because they're the extreme voices in government. They have a lot of power in government right now. But the ramifications for what this could look like down the line, I think, are going to improve America's democracy overall.
Okay, that's very interesting. The Senate is currently on a knife edge, more or less. So there's Georgia is going to a runoff, which is what I want to come back to in a second. But it looks like Arizona is towards the Democrats and Nevada towards the Republicans. And those are the two currently uncalled states at the moment.
Well, I would like to say something on Nevada, though. Currently, it's a 2-point lead for the Republicans, but a lot of analysis is saying that the 25% of votes yet to be counted are in Democrat areas. So actually, it's looking like it could be a slim Democrat win, but we don't really know that yet.
Arizona goes blue, and let's say that Nevada very narrowly goes red. Something that I think has been missed in a lot of the analysis so far has been that if it is the 50th seat that the Democrats are trying to win in Georgia, this is exactly the same as happened 2 years ago. You may remember that after the presidential election, there was a special election in January, which had the Senate seats of Georgia up for grabs as well. And what happened then was that Trump was so unpopular. This was shortly before the January 6th event, but he was so unpopular, his absence of a concession, his conspiracy theories, Stop It the Steal, had so unpopular that it dissuaded Republican turnout in this Senate race. Now, one of these same seats is the one Raphael Warnock is fighting for re-election, and it looks like it's going to a runoff against Herschel Walker. Well, it definitely is going to runoff. What can we expect if this is the swing seat again? Can we expect exactly the same thing, a narrow Democratic win in the runoff, or is something different going to happen? Emma?
I think I wouldn't be surprised if it is a narrow Democratic win in the runoff. A lot of that is because Herschel Walker is quite a polarizing figure. I think, again, this is a good place where you can look at last year's election results. You can see that Georgia voters don't necessarily want this extremism. They might have conservative leanings, but they don't really want extremism. So that would be my prediction for it. But I think also undercutting all of this is the fact that things can change very quickly, and maybe predictions aren't as accurate as we think they are.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats are about 1 point up in this state so far. No one's reached the 50%. Yeah, I'd say just about a Democrat win. I think I agree with your analysis there. But who knows? Going into the winter, we could see more developments.
We'll have to see. I have just a few more points left. This one briefly. Is abortion not the big winner that the Republicans thought it was going to be? So there were 6 referendums, all with different wording. So some of these were to enshrine abortion access into the Constitution. Some of these were to were basically yes/nos on abortion bans. So these numbers aren't directly comparable. But across 6 different states, the abortion side, pro-abortion side won. So the pro-choice side won the ballot. This is as far as Kentucky, where 52% came out against the idea of basically banning many, like a large section of abortions. I don't know the precise period or number of weeks in. But if all 6 states had rejected this, and it's clearly been a motivator for turnout on the Democratic side, can we expect this to now, the dynamics of this issue, because this was always a turnout driver for the Republicans, is this now a turnout driver for the Democrats?
I think it's definitely been a turnout driver for the Democrats. Again, as we talked about before, this was one of the biggest issues in this midterm. This is what caused the greatest turnout. I mean, this is, I would say, probably the reason why you have these unexpected results right now. I think that it'll depend on how the Democrats take this going forward. I think I could see this becoming sort of enshrined into the extreme side of the party platform. I think that would be politicizing this issue more would potentially turn this back towards Republican favor. I think rather...
So what are you advising Democrats against doing?
I guess I'm advising Democrats against taking this the same direction that they took Black Lives Matter, for example, into making this such a polarizing issue that it'll actually push people back against this sort of liberal woke agenda. That isn't what's at stake here. This is literally people's health, people's freedoms. Like this issue is going to impact a lot of poorer communities. It's going to affect people who don't have good transportation, who can't leave their state very easily. And I think Democrats can use this to their advantage in that it is a big issue that matters to a huge portion of the electorate. But I think there is definitely the potential to over-pushing this and to making it much more polarizing.
A few more points here. Ben, I'd like you mentioned briefly earlier about Ron DeSantis' results in Florida. Tell me, the man, many of our listeners probably won't know who Ron DeSantis is. Can you give us a background and how has he positioned himself into this election and coming out of it?
Yeah, so Ron DeSantis was it's effectively a much younger. He's in his 40s. He's seen as a far more professional version of Trump almost. Now I've heard the word moderate be thrown around quite a bit.
Sorry, what race was he running in?
Oh, so he was in the Florida governorship race, and he's been the Florida governor since 2018. I want to say.
So, yeah,
2018, and he only narrowly won that one. He won this one by 20 points.
Wow.
He is hugely popular. Effectively, Florida has been turned into a very safe Republican seat now. One of the most sort of amazing stats out of this is that he managed to shift the Miami-Wade constituency.
I know that one of our contributors later is keen to talk about that.
Yeah, and this is huge, really. This has not been Republican since 2010. He's won this by 11 points. That is amazingly a 40-point swing since 2016. So DeSantis is effectively got a lot of the same values as Trump, but he's a lot cleaner, a lot more professional, and is certainly looked like he is positioning himself to be a proper rival to Trump.
I think it's also important to note that Trump doesn't like him. That I don't know if you saw he
de-sanctimonious.
Yes,
I think was
exactly.
The name.
That was the phrasing used.
Yeah.
So Trump has spoken out on his social media platform about how he sees Santos as a competitor.
Yeah.
Right. And
he's threatened.
He is threatened. And instead of sort of moving aside for another Republican to sort of take over his own party agenda, he sees him as a threat to Trump himself.
I think some of the context of this election, we are expecting Donald Trump before the midterms had heavily signalled that next week he was going to announce formally his run for 2020.
That's now been pushed towards the end of the runoff.
Yeah, this is now gone in the air a lot more. Trump quite ominously said he has a lot of dirt on DeSantis.
Yeah.
And so a primary race between those two, the real winner could actually be the Democrats. Trump is looking as if... Rationally, you'd think, Trump's 76, he's got a good person here to sort of carry on his legacy. But of course, Trump doesn't always act rationally. And I think if he can't win, he may attempt to bring DeSantis down with him.
Emma, is DeSantis a genuine contender for the Republican nomination in 2024?
I think he's definitely a genuine contender. I mean, we've talked about a few times now how a big push in this election was the fact that people don't want to vote for Trump candidates. They think that they're too extreme. They think that, I think a lot of people just think that they're not very serious either. Is he now the
favourite?
I think that'll remain to be seen.
Ben?
I'm going to agree with you, but what I would say is you cannot predict anything, especially in US politics. But yes, DeSantis has a way of wrapping up Trumpism with a nice bow tie and selling it to people a lot more than what Trump can, and we've seen that in this election.
The argument I find against a lot of what is DeSantis advocates in the GOP have said is that basically he's swung heavily Hispanic, he's swung poorer communities in their favour. What I would argue against that is maybe I'd question his national profile. Can he really win outside of Florida? So DeSantis won about 59% of the vote, but Rubio, his Senate, won. Rubio, the Republican Senate race in Florida, won 58%. There's a 1-point swing between the Senate candidate and the gubernatorial candidate. Are we really promoting the gubernatorial candidate as someone so amazing and so precious to the Republican Party if he's only won 1 point more than... Isn't it just saying that Florida is now a red state?
What I would say is that Trump only beat Biden by 3 points 2 years ago, and DeSantis beat his contender by 20. We don't know if he can repeat it. But Trump's...
But if the Senate candidate is also winning in a landslide, this is not saying more about Florida than it does about the governorship and the governor.
Do you want to figure out?
Yeah, I'd say potentially, but if we're comparing it, because effectively it will be DeSantis or Trump. No one else within the Republican Party has got enough sway. There's been talks about Kristi Noem. We don't think so.
I would be hesitant to make that prediction 2 years out.
Yes, anything could change, but Trump is looking increasingly toxic to voters.
Yeah.
And Trump endorsed candidates, we've seen that. DeSantis we've only ever seen him grow his base. And so from what we've seen so far, DeSantis is on a better trajectory than Trump.
I think I would also say, you mentioned Hispanic voters. I think that's actually going to be a huge factor in the 2024 election. Actually, a big reason why people tend to assume that Hispanics are going to vote Democrat was because of the California governor election in the 90s, in which this whole sort of thing. If you want to hear more about it, the Run Up podcast does a wonderful overview of it. But essentially,
New York Times?
Yes, this is a Times podcast. So essentially, in California, I want to say it was 91, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Peter Wilson was running as basically a proto-Trump candidate. He was very anti-immigration, very, very right, very extreme, and the Hispanic community in California turned up in huge numbers against him, and his term was finished after a year or two. Mm-hmm. He really turned them against the Republican Party with super extreme rhetoric. I think if you have a conservative candidate coming in who can appeal to Hispanic voters rather than alienating them, I think that could be a winner for the Republicans. Again, I also hesitate to say anything 2 years out because we do know things can change very quickly. But I think if you already see members of the Republican Party, even far-right members, turning against Trump and turning against Trump candidates, I think DeSantis is looking like probably your best option.
Certainly the best position. We'll have to ask our Republican later on what he thinks of the likelihood and who he would possibly support in this kind of battle of the Titans. We'll see. Just one final question for you two before we lead into that sort of debate would be, what does this mean for 2024? Biden has put off saying if he's going to run, at least until the end of this, so he's undecided yet, and Trump has similarly put off what he's going to do. Do you think that this is going to be a Biden election again? And if so, do you think he has any chance of success?
It's been a very good midterms for Biden. Sort of, you go into them as the president knowing you're going to get a bit of a kicking, and this has been a sort of...
Shellacking.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Obama was really hurt in 2010 and 2014 and came back to win the 2012 election. Now, the vibe is different here. We still do not believe that Biden... There's not as much confidence in Biden, and that's because I think fundamentally US politics and politics in general is a bit ageist, and I think a lot of people might be able to sort of see Biden as...
There's some fair reservations about
his age. Exactly, yeah. I mean, he has done objectively quite a good job, really. But...
For the Democrats.
Yeah, for the Democrats. But just sort of generally, actually just sort of in the role, considering his age. But I think the Democrats have got a real big issue here, where they have got a older elite of the party and then a growing youth sort of AOC-like types, but they haven't got that sort of mid-aged, sort of almost prime time politician, and that could really hurt them going into 2024.
Emma? Kamala Harris, the answer?
I think...
Our vice president.
Yes. Kamala Harris is from Oakland, actually, about an hour away from where I live. So it was a really big deal because she was district attorney for San Francisco. So we've always actually known quite a lot about her growing up. When she was put on the ticket, my family was super enthusiastic. My mom really likes her. But I think she has alienated herself a bit too much. And I think you can see that in that you don't hear a lot about Harris anymore. I think that's probably a good thing because she's been attacked quite heavily.
Considering she's the swing vote of the Senate.
Exactly, yeah. Where I think keeping a lower profile is probably the best thing that she can do. I don't think she's gonna be a great candidate in 2024. Biden, I think right now he is also riding a bit of an approval high that came out of his response to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. If you look at prior to the summer, his approval ratings was dropped even lower. He was in the 30s. That skyrocketed because of his response to Ukraine. It's already starting to go down. This, obviously, the midterms have been really good for him. He's quite chuffed right now. But I don't think he's going to be able to keep that up for another 2 years.
So just briefly, before we finish, I realise that we've gone on for a while now. Who do you think that the Democratic candidate and Republican candidate will be for 2024? I mean, I know it's far out. You've both said probably DeSantis is best position for Republicans.
Yeah, DeSantis for Republicans.
I'd have to agree.
I do not know for the Democrats. Biden, I think there's going to be a lot of advice for him to step down, whether he wants to or not.
Yeah.
I don't know. The thing with Kamala Harris is I saw Biden with Obama more during this campaign than Biden with his own vice president. The real issue for the Democrats is their best politician is a previous president, and that's big. I can't call who their candidate will be.
I think, in the run-up to the 2020 election, you had one of the widest tickets that the Democratic Party has ever had. I think there is honestly quite a lot of talent to choose from. What jumped out to me in that was probably Pete Buttigieg.
He ran last time, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Buttigieg. I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong. But
no, it's good.
I think that the talent is there if you look for it, but none of it has been very mainstream. I think a lot of these candidates have sort of faded away into the background. So I wouldn't necessarily put my bets on anybody right now because there's definitely a lot of space for somebody to come forward and make themselves known on the political stage. But I think first you're going to need Biden to concede that he's not going to run again.
So there's no DeSantis of the left. If you had to...
At the moment, probably not.
If you had to call the 2024 presidential now, in a word, both of you, blue or red?
As of right now, red.
Ask me after Donald Trump says whether or not he's going to run.
If he does?
If he does, blue.
If he doesn't?
Red.
Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you guys for joining us. We've got 4 people in front of me right now who sat through the first part very quietly and so know a bit of the context of what we've already discussed. We've managed to get 4 people on board for this, ranging from left to right, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your time, so thank you very much. I'm going to introduce you one at a time, and then if you could add any details you think are relevant for our audience to know. So first we've got Maggie on the left, who is a Democrat from New York. Hey, Maggie.
Hi there, Finton. Very, very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. Next we have Matteo, a Democrat from Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Vincent. It's great to be here likewise.
Yeah, perfect. Never had so many American accents in one room. Next we've got Kieran, who is an independent from Colorado but was raised Republican. Kieran?
Hi, it's good to be here.
Yeah, great. And finally we've got Patrick from Virginia, who is a Republican.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
Perfect. Thank you guys all for being here. I'd like to know, just to warm up slowly for you guys, what happened in your state during these midterms and what do you think about it? Can we start with Maggie?
Sure thing. Well, New York was lots of fun, real nail-biter. Many things of note happened, I'd say. A, we passed a $6.4 billion environmental bond to fight climate change, and that was voted on by the voters in the state. Our governor, Kathy Hochul, won, it's not appropriate to say re-election, because she was never elected in the first place. She succeeded Andrew Cuomo when he resigned, but she won election to continue her time as governor. In my home congressional district, a Democrat won, which was nice, but not a sure thing, so that was nice. And I think, as you alluded to earlier in the podcast, redistricting in New York has not favored Democrats at all. We had a lot of Democrat incumbents running against each other in primaries. It was a whole mess, and as a result, I think the Republicans had a pretty good time in upstate New York, and the Republican candidate for governor did very, very well and actually came very close to winning the governorship.
Okay, so New York's swinging red slightly?
I think the rural parts of New York have
Upstate.
always been red, yes, and they had good turnout and they were galvanized on the issues this year.
Perfect. Matteo, anything in DC?
Well, first of all, DC is, as always, not a state, which is lots of fun. So it's a very blue federal district, and as always, the Democrats swept the ticket. So our representative, our shadow representative in Congress, Eleanor Holmes, won 86% of the vote, which is, I'd say, a pretty standard showing in D.C. Then, obviously, we have mayoral elections and city council elections, and Muriel Bowser secured the position as mayor in D.C., even though that was a pretty controversial race. She wasn't especially popular within D.C. for a variety of reasons, including her stance on policing and gun control. And in the city council, as always, Democrats swept clean through, though there is some variation ideologically in where they stand. Some are more progressive, some are more moderate. However, as always, it's unlikely that any major changes for positives are coming to D.C., mainly because of what happened in the midterms nationally, with the Republicans probably securing the House.
Yeah, so Matteo rightly pointed out that D.C. is not a state, of course, and they don't have representatives in either the Senate or the House, which is why he's slightly different, but still a valuable Democratic voice, I'm sure you'll all hear during this podcast. Kieran, Colorado.
Yeah, in Colorado, this House race hasn't been called yet, but it's four out of 8 of those seats have gone blue so far, with 2 of them going red. The other 2 haven't been called. I'm presuming that the Democrats will win because Colorado is typically pretty safely Democrat. And in the Senate race, the Democrat candidate won. Overall, Colorado kind of stayed along what you would expect, as it's typically a blue state, and it stayed that way. The governor, same guy, Polis, won. Also a Democrat, but my county where I'm from was safely red, as it always is, but that's pretty much it. Like, it was expected to go blue, and it's gone blue.
Yeah, so 55 to 52% more or less. 55 to 42% more or less in Colorado. And going back to Maggie's point, the Republican got 43% of the vote, the Democrats 56. Chuck Schumer. Or Charles Schumer?
Yes, is my senator, yes.
Charles, is that
Charles, and Chuck is the nickname.
So
it's the same man, same man himself, yeah.
Leader of...
yeah, well, yes, and hopefully continuing to be the leader of the Senate.
Yeah, well, we'll discuss that.
We'll see.
And finally, Patrick, what went down in Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, Virginia is always quite a boring midterm, especially this year. We didn't have any gubernatorial or Senate races in the state. We did have, of course, the House of Reps, which as always, Virginia is quite a blue state, quite Democrat-led state. Having said that, both parties in Virginia tend to be quite, well, particularly the Republicans are forced to be pretty moderate. So, I mean, you don't see, just as you mentioned in the first part, you don't exactly see many MAGA Republicans, very pro-Trump Republicans in Virginia. Possibly also because you're so close to D.C., that could be quite dangerous for the party. So this year, I mean, just another standard midterms for Virginia.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you all. We've discussed in the previous segment what the overall results are. We don't know the composition of the House or the Senate yet, but we know that both of them are going to be very, very close. In 1 or 2 sentences, try not to go over that because you're going to inevitably cover what the person next to you wants to say after you. What does this mean America is thinking? If you could pull out one issue that you think is really important for Americans and what it meant, so we could hopefully get 4 different issues. If we could start with Kieran.
People are mad about the Roe v. Wade decision.
Mm-hmm. The Dobbs decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Would you explain what the Dobbs decision was?
Well, basically, they've overturned Roe v. Wade, which has created a lot of question about whether or not people are going to have access to abortion in a lot of different states, and that caused steep increase in women's voter turnout and in young people's voter turnout. So I think that was a very big deciding factor in the midterms.
Yeah, thank you. Mateo?
I think it showed that Republicans possess a kind of self-destructive tendency. I mean, it was in so many ways their election to lose, and it certainly looked like they were going to blitz the Democrats in the House and Senate. And yet, for a whole host of reasons, really, that hasn't happened. And at the end of the day, the only people that they can blame, as they inevitably will, are, you know, themselves and the party officials that have brought them down this road.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Patrick?
Yeah, I think I agree with both points. I mean, looking at crime, the environment, immigration, the economy, and everything that Biden has done, the biggest decision that people took into account these midterms was the issue of abortion, I think. But then we've also seen what Mateo just said, that Republicans do sometimes tend to have a self-destructive nature around them, especially when, you know, they're the big favorites and they don't take advantage of it.
Yeah, thank you. Maggie, any big points that's not been hit so far?
I want all of the Republican communication strategists to start working for the Democrats, because I think that the fact that virtually none of the Democrats' really impressive legislative record over the 2 years was discussed, or is really in the common parlance when we discuss these midterm elections, is surprising to me. I think they could have focused more on that. And I think the fact that abortion overtook everything maybe speaks to the fact that we're pretty bad about touting our own accomplishments.
What accomplishments would you have advised?
Well, let's start with the Inflation Reduction Act, 40% reduction in U.S. carbon emissions by 2030. Start with the CHIPS Act, becoming competitive with China. That's a big one to push. Various other measures. I'm kind of blanking on the names of the rest of the bills, but it'll come to me.
No? Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. So the Republicans are self-destructive, people were mad about abortion, and there's essentially the main 2 points. The communications that on the red side was, I would agree, pretty dire. Would you argue, Patrick, there was complacency amongst the Republicans about what these midterms would bring?
I don't know if that's the right word to use. I mean, I guess you could say many Republicans, not only Republicans, but everyone is quite positive that Republicans were, I mean, the big red wave, right, was going to hit these midterms. We've seen that not to be the case. We've seen many Republicans blaming one certain figure within the party, whether that's right or wrong. I mean, it's...
Do you blame Donald Trump for crushing the elephant?
I wouldn't say it's 100% his fault, just because you can't totally just blame one single person, but I don't, I understand why these people would blame him. I do agree to a certain extent, maybe if Trump wasn't such a big figure within the party anymore, or if Trump's, personality kind of changed since 2020, then I do really believe that, the Republicans would have been on track to have 52, maybe even 53 seats in the Senate and then win the House by 20 seats.
Maggie, do you blame Trump more for the Democrats', I wouldn't say resounding success, but better than expected showing?
Sure, I
maybe not blame, maybe praise.
I don't think he helped per se. Again, I think the abortion thing was really positive for Democrats. If I could have, tugged on Amy Coney Barrett's ear, I would have said, push the Dobbs decision even later. Like, let's go to August, because then people are even more fired up. We're looking at even more turnout because of that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Trump was always going to be central to a Republican election and a Republican effort. And I think that what he did, I think that there is a rationale. I think that he thought that the conditions in America were ripe for him to fully Trumpify the party by essentially forcing a slate of his picked candidates into Congress to eliminate any possible resistance that might happen within the party later on if he's reelected. And with inflation, with crime, with Ukraine, I think he thought that it was, if there was any moment that was appropriate to do that, it would be now. And obviously, he miscalculated.
Okay, so forget the Republicans damaging themselves. Has Donald Trump damaged himself, and if so, irrevocably?
I think that Donald Trump's profile has obviously not been helped by the midterms. However, it's American politics. It's the Republican Party. Who knows? Genuinely. I saw this morning that the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia came out and said that Trump is essentially unrunnable, that he can no longer get Republicans reliable victory. But as Patrick said, Virginia is a very moderate state. The Republican Party is very diverse in a way. And so it remains to be seen, really, whether they also come to the realization that Trump is no longer a kind of guarantor of victory.
Okay. Has it been, Patrick, bad for your own party that Republicans are now more worried about getting primaried, so beaten in the run-up to the election when they're going for selection within the party by a Trump candidate than they are about the actual result? Has it been unhealthy for your party?
I think, on the one hand, it has been. I mean, you look at, people endorsed by Trump. I mean, Trump has been saying over the past couple of days since the midterms how well all of his endorsed candidates have done. On one hand, that is true. I mean, he has won a lot of seats in the House of Reps. On the other hand, the 19 that lost were the only 19 that were in states where everyone knew there were going to be quite tight races.
The swing ones lost.
Exactly. All 19 of them have lost. And apart from that, you have races in the Senate. You have them in Georgia, Arizona, the two best examples where, candidates like Herschel Walker. Yeah, blanking Herschel Walker has, said over and over again how the 2020 election was stolen, how Trump is still our president. Same in Arizona. And I mean, you've seen the results here. It's looking terrible for the Republicans. I mean, Georgia's gone to a race-off in a month.
I was about to ask, actually. So we know now that Georgia's gone to a runoff in the start of December. If, as he said he wouldn't, but if Donald Trump had declared before this runoff in December, do you think that would have been an asset or a liability for your party?
I think it really would have damaged any Republican chance in Georgia for the runoff. I think Trump, although, he still holds a lot of value to the Republican Party. Trump's still very important to the party, right? I mean, he's still has 71% approval rating within the party. Well, this was the day right before the midterms. We've seen that. Now, with DeSantis winning so much, who already was such a popular figure, you never know. I still think that Trump, jumping ahead a little bit to the presidential elections, but I still think Trump has a big chance. But I do think that it would have damaged Georgia.
Okay, thank you. Specifically starting with Maggie for this one. Maggie, Joe Biden argued for a lot of this campaign that democracy was on the ballot. Is that not disingenuous?
Fintan, I know where you're going with this, and yes, I agree it was. If you're alluding to the fact that Democrats funded MAGA Republicans' campaigns in primaries in order to make the general elections easier for them in swing states.
Yep.
Is that what you are?
I was going to segue into that swiftly later.
Brilliant.
Yes. But,
couldn't agree more.
Generally, if there had been a red wave, is democracy under threat in America?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because Republicans don't go in for that sort of thing. Democracy.
Patrick, Democrat? Are you a Democrat? in terms of democracy, not in terms of...
Absolutely, I'd really disagree with that. I mean, we've seen the key example, Florida this midterm, who won? Ron DeSantis, one of the most popular, if not the most popular Republican or overall politician in the states right now, right? Big Republican. The only difference between him and Trump is the actual person. He is a Trumpist in terms of policies, a lot of similar policies. He's just a younger and smarter version of Trump. He knows when not to speak and when to speak. And he has, over these past 4 years as governor of Florida, really promoted democracy. I mean, the things he's done over the past few years, 2.5 years during the pandemic, has shown that he's respected the voice of the people in Florida, and the results showed.
You are correct to assert that he has won a larger mandate, and possibly you can interpret that as a sign of endorsement from the people of Florida that what he did, especially during the pandemic, when he had the most liberal in the sense of free and open policies of almost any state. But do you not concede that candidates like Herschel Walker, these Stop the Steal people, are damaging for democracy, if not to the threat that Joe Biden had made it out to be? Are these people not genuinely damaging for democracy if you've got people that will not concede after an election?
I mean, again, it's an individual right not to do that. Some people may disagree. I personally have always said after the 2020 election, Trump should have never gone out for months and months, and still doing it now, and, going out to the public and being like, I disagree, I'm still the president. But I don't think it's damaging to democracy necessarily. I think there's a difference between damaging democracy and, countering the system.
I'm interested in what our independent has to say.
Yeah, I think that there can be an argument definitely made that if there's these politicians that lose an election and then they're going out and saying, well, that's not valid. Like, I didn't lose. I should still be the president. And then there's subsequent candidates under them being like, well, yeah, no, Trump's still the president. Like, this is like, Biden's not our president. I feel like that's kind of, if you look at that objectively, they are actively trying to undermine the Democratic decision that was made in 2020. Like, Biden won the vote, and to have politicians in the Senate, in Congress, saying, well, no, he didn't, I think that just fully, it's disregarding the people's decision.
Just a reminder that in early 2021, 139 Republican representatives and 8 Republican senators did not vote to certify the election results, which generally, and Patrick has agreed, were legitimate. Matteo?
I think that, it sets a precedent when the head of the party, you're essentially like your paleo-conservative prophet, as I think we can call him, refuses to certify an election, to admit that he's lost, because that there's patterns in politics that follow that, wherein candidates will see that example and play to that kind of model that now he's set up for. What I will say is that I think Republicans have generally across the board realized that the democracy argument has cost them. Because other than, I think the one that comes to mind is Karamo in Michigan, who lost by 14 points in the Secretary of State race, and she still hasn't conceded. But most other Republican candidates, especially the election deniers, have conceded so far. So I think that they have realized that this is a self-harming route to go down if they fail to uphold the norms of American democracy.
On one level, I couldn't agree more. I think on another level, the anti-democracy thing has been very effective for Republicans. An example I'll bring up is the absolute sham of the 2020 census that Trump conducted that vastly undercounted Democrats, and because of which Democrats have lost, a district in New York and a district in California.
Gerrymandering?
Yes, so that was population undercounting in the census, was the first step by which one of the upstate districts in New York was subsumed into other districts because there wasn't the requisite population
just
for it.
Just to remind our listeners that every state has 2 Senate seats, but House seats are done by population, which is what Maggie's referring to. New York lost one House seat in the recent redistricting. Sorry. Yeah.
So no, I just bring that up as an example in which undermining these sort of sanctified processes like the census, by which we generally want an impartial and fair result, does win Republicans sort of easy seats at the margins.
So, would you like to answer, Patrick, any of these allegations against your party?
I mean, again, I understand, and I totally agree with what all of you were saying regarding, conceding a loss, right? You lost, whether, for example, the biggest one, the 2020 election with Trump, whether there is proof or there are allegations, should I say, of some voter fraud, of, fake ballots being casted in, whether there is or not. Personally, I don't think, even if there was, it wouldn't have been enough for Trump to be president. I think Trump definitely knows that. The whole Republican Party knows that. And what they should have done is, kind of change the face of the Republican Party. Would have been the right time to do it. Start fresh, and it would have given them, I think, a huge win in 2022, followed by most likely landslide in 2024. Now that hasn't happened, that Republicans, or some Republicans, didn't do that. I mean, the Republican Party right now is at a huge disadvantage, right, to what it could have been.
On the other hand, just to play devil's advocate for you, losers don't get anywhere. When Al Gore conceded the 2000 election on a technicality which arguably was, well, not arguably, I would say genuinely was far more legitimate than a lot of the quibbles Trump had with this election. There are Democrats that were in opposition for 8 years. If he had arguably contested that election, taken it further in the Supreme Court and not conceded, then that would have been damaging for democracy. But from pure political pragmatism, surely that was a terrible decision to the Democrats. Why would Trump want to do what Gore did, who's now in genuine political obscurity? Matteo?
It just sets political precedent. It sets bad precedent. I think that when you're running for president of the United States, one of the requirements is to have the bigger picture in mind and to know that if you do choose to contest an election, if Al Gore had contested in 2000, that sets a precedent for races afterwards. And even though it might help you in the short run, in the long run, there's a strong chance that that will come back to bite you. And I think that American democracy is so often about balancing that precedent against short-term gain, with things like packing the Supreme Court. And it's a political calculus that I think lawmakers have to constantly make to avoid A, an erosion of democratic norms, and B, for their own political party, that their strategies don't come back to harm them in the long run.
Similar, Karen? No? Mackie?
Al Gore's my celebrity crush.
Yes. the activism, the good looks, the charisma.
Yes, all of it.
All of it.
I could watch an Al Gore documentary over and over and over again.
Perfect. Why do you think, other than the abortion issue carrying so much weight, why do you think that inflation wasn't? Because normally, simplistic analyses would say that the more inflation we have, the lower growth we have, the worse the president does. Surely these issues should have bitten more for the Republicans. Maybe, I mean, we were expecting a Republican tsunami. There was, like we said, a Republican ripple at the start. Surely there should have been a smaller wave. Why did inflation not bite any of you?
If I can answer first, I would say that Democrat candidates, both for Senate, governor, and just representatives, really targeted Republicans where it hurts most. Whenever there was a Republican candidate, they would label them as, pro-life evil maniacs, right? Which we've seen in Pennsylvania. And I think that is the sole reason why Fetterman managed to defeat Dr. Oz, right? I mean, from the very start, Fetterman has always labeled Oz as a pro-life evil maniac, right? Which was very popular among many Democrats, a lot of moderate Republicans, right, who don't believe in pro-life policies. And that kind of took the scope away from inflation, from different economic failures that the Biden administration has undertook America over these past 2 years, and shifted the focus on more social issues that Democrats are more popular for.
The democracy issue. Yeah. During that question, I was doing some research, and I was correct that I would like either of our two Democrats to answer this. The Republicans have put democracy on the ballot through their non-concessions, but in 2018, Stacey Abrams, running in Georgia, also did not concede her gubernatorial race. Surely it was just the pot calling the kettle black, no?
Well, I think actually there's quite a bit of nuance with Stacey, especially in regards to recent allegations made against her. But I think there's a big difference between, and maybe you agree, Matteo, the legitimate voter suppression that does happen in Republican-led states. I mean, the cleansing of voter rolls for no reason, the placing polling stations as far away from a minority community as we can possibly get. I think that's all very legitimate. I honestly don't know enough about the Georgia election to defend Stacey in that instance, but I think that's a very legitimate concern.
I generally agree. I think that voter suppression, particularly in the South, and this is something that Stacey Abrams has really committed herself to in Georgia. Voter suppression in the South is historically a central issue. It's been really, 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 really bad down the years. And recently as well, there's been kind of an erosion of democratic norms in regards to voting, with really strict ID laws that disproportionately affect minorities. Again, I think that Stacey Abrams is... she's put a lot of work into Georgia, into ending voter suppression, into making it easier to vote. And I think that that's one of the main reasons as to why Georgia has become, I think, probably the swing state in the country. It's mostly down to the kind of grassroots outreach that Stacey Abrams has done. However, I think that down across the Sun Belt and in the Deep South, voter suppression remains an issue. And will probably remain an issue for the foreseeable future, with state legislatures being firmly in Republican hands.
Okay, thank you. Kieran, these democracy debates that the two parties are having, as a more independent-minded voter, do these arguments sway you, or are you more concerned with the economy? And I know for you personally, you talked about abortion as the big driver, but to what extent does this democracy argument really sway you?
Well, I think that the democracy argument is very relevant, but I think as much as we can talk about the Republican Party undermining democracy by not conceding, I think what the Democrats did in this midterm election with the funding of MAGA candidates, I think in a way that can be construed as an undermining of democracy as well.
And for the record, this is something that Maggie alluded to earlier, where Democratic political action committees, or PACs, were funding the most extreme right of the Republican nominations in the race internally within the party beforehand, in the primaries, in an effort to have Trump figures come to the fore in these national races and then lose, which arguably has worked. But this is what we were both alluding to.
I think it was a good strategy on the Democrats' part. It worked for them, but I think it did, it gave an unfair advantage to these MAGA candidates, and then that kind of took away some of the electorate power of, centrist Republicans who wouldn't have otherwise voted that way. So I think for me, the democracy argument, I look at both parties and see they both do it.
Are the Democrats hypocrites?
Well, I think most politicians are.
Are the Democrats hypocrites?
In this instance, maybe.
Yeah.
Can I just interject something here, though? And fine, I don't know if I were Democratic leadership, I would have made that choice, certainly. But if we're talking about one party that is a party of election deniers and another party that has funded election deniers so that it can have a greater chance of winning, those aren't the same thing, are they?
But isn't that playing with fire? When it's like pointing at a house and saying, the house is burning, the house is burning. If we put a bit more fuel on it, then maybe the fire brigade will come faster.
Yes, and the Democrats are the fire brigade in this instance.
Democrats are the ones throwing
the gas, but they're also, we have to admit, the fire brigade. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Does that make it right?
No.
No, Patrick?
I do think it's still a bit hypocritical. I mean, for the past 6 years, Democrats have been, offloading at Trump for doing this, right? And now we're seeing the Democrats do exactly what Trump was told off for doing.
But I think, again, the critical distinction is the Democrats aren't doing this. The Democrats are funding the Republicans who are doing this.
And who's causing it? If it wasn't for the Democrats funding the Republicans, for the Democrat-led PACs and super PACs doing this wouldn't have happened, right? And the Democrats most likely would have lost certain important seats.
And Patrick does have a point in that you're saying that the extreme candidates are the most popular, but aren't the Democrats giving them this platform to then be the most popular, the highest fundraisers? Matteo?
Yeah, I think that it's, again, a balance of short-term considerations and long-term considerations. I think that within the short term, it's obviously worked wonders for Democrats, and I think that it's been a very successful political strategy.
The fire brigade did come.
Exactly. And so I think that there's a corresponding upside. What I do worry about is what centrist Republicans feel and think. That minority, that little fringe that doesn't really kowtow to Trumpist demands. I think of, Valadao in California, who, ran on pretty moderate centrist policies because he had to in a very moderate district. And he narrowly won his primary. So I'm worried about that little minority of Martians within the Republican Party that maintains a kind of ideological moderation and what this policy means for them, and how this might, within the next few years, really force the Republican Party to an extreme.
Yeah, and just to go back to Maggie's point about they are two different things, like the Democrats funding MAGA candidates and then Republicans straight up denying election results. One of those, to me, the Republicans denying election results is a way more direct opposition to democracy, but I don't think it's fair that we acknowledge that and we don't acknowledge the Democrats also undermining democracy. Whether or not one is worse than the other, that can be argued, but I do think both of them have done it. So as an independent looking at this election, the argument of democracy, it's just both parties are shady in that arena, so I don't think that it held as much weight in the electorate.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting. I'd like to move on to, we've mentioned the Dobbs decision. Patrick, firstly, have the Republicans, we mentioned this briefly before with Emma and Ben, have the Republicans shot themselves in the foot by making abortion such a big issue? I know that it was the Supreme Court that made the decision, but it was a political decision.
Absolutely. Actually, for the midterms, I don't think that it was the Republicans that made abortion such a big decision. I think it was actually the Democrats that wanted to make it such a big decision because they knew it would favor them.
But the Republicans enabled it through their nominations, no, to the Supreme Court?
They did. But, I mean, a party that, well, first of all, it's not all the party. Many Republican politicians don't actually agree with the Dobbs decision, right? Many of them were pro-choice, still are pro-choice, and they would have preferred the Supreme Court not take this decision. But now that it was taken, I mean, the Republican Party couldn't just, I think it would have been a worse turnout for the GOP if half of the party was like, yeah, this was an amazing decision, let's scrap abortion, but then the other half, kind of side with the Democrats and be like, no, this was actually a terrible decision. What has Trump done appointing 3 pro-life nominees to the exactly? So I think it would have split it even more than Trump has over the past 6 days.
Very interesting. Kieran, as someone raised in the Republican area, is abortion kind of a moot point for these economic conservatives that vote red?
I don't think it is, because in my county, I was talking to my mom on the phone last night about it. There's several people that she knows who are always voting Republican, no matter what, they vote red. And then this midterm election, they switched up because of this abortion ruling. It's such an important issue to
Sorry, so my point was more, is abortion popular? Can we expect 60-70% of Americans, polling generally shows, support abortion access to some extent?
Mm-hmm.
So would you argue that even in your red county, abortion is, it seems to be what you're saying, if they're switching to blue, they still value it, yes?
Yeah, I think the vast majority of people are going to say that let's keep our abortion rights. So I think focusing that much on it, I agree maybe the Democrats did amplify how much Republicans are trying to take away abortion access, but Republicans probably just shouldn't have gone down that path in the first place.
Abortion, a moot point?
No, I think wildly popular. I think increasingly cultural issues are the grounds on which parties define themselves as class loyalties fade away into a neoliberal nothingness. But that's another podcast episode that I hope you'll let me do, Fenton.
Next week.
Yes, exactly. I think abortion really, really matters. And again, I think DeSantis is another example of, I think, a cultural king, a king of stoking culture war. And I think this is a front on which Democrats are winning the culture war.
And I think that there's been generally a reframing of American politics and all of its issues through a cultural lens. Even economic issues, I think you can now read into them as a lens between two very different cultural groups in left and right. And so I think that, within the next few years, really, cultural issues are going to be coming to the fore, because mostly you can argue that the way that politics is perceived in America now is through this culture war lens because of the fact that politicians have been pushing it onto us so aggressively, like DeSantis in Florida, for instance.
On that point, just to take it across, do the Democrats have to give up on Florida now? Or is this the hallmark of an incredibly popular, incredibly lucky local politician?
Well, I think that one of the main misconceptions that's made, and this is kind of a more general point, but one of the main misconceptions that is made is when people talk about Hispanics as a voting group, they make it sound very monolithic. That's not the case. The Hispanic community in Florida is predominantly Cuban, and that means something very different from the Hispanic communities in California and in Texas. So, for instance, you can look at how the Cubans in 2020 swung Florida for Trump, whereas just now in the gubernatorial election in Texas, the Rio Grande Belt on the border with Mexico, which is predominantly Hispanic, voted overwhelmingly for O'Rourke against Abbott. Yeah. And so I think that with Florida, it's difficult because people normally think about having to sway the Hispanic community as the key to reclaiming Florida, playing to their interests. But I think that in a lot of ways recently, Republicans have been very good at realizing that on social issues, the Florida Hispanic community might actually be closer to where they are. It's just that they have to cut out the xenophobic rhetoric, which is obviously a main trait of a lot of their rhetoric over the years.
I'd actually disagree with that. I think, especially with the first point that you made, that Florida is mostly made up of, the Hispanic community in Florida is mostly made up of Cubans. That is true, but the fact is we've seen since the 2020 elections, we've seen huge growth in all different categories of Hispanics in Florida. I mean, Cubans in this election are in the basically 70% for DeSantis. Puerto Ricans are in the low to mid 60%, and the other Hispanics, so mostly Mexicans and Colombians, which are the two main categories, went from mid to high 30s in 2020 to low to mid 50s, so 20-point increase, right? So I think it's not only Cubans that kind of gave DeSantis, and this is another common misconception, that the only person in Florida is DeSantis. That's not true. Florida right now has not one Democrat seat, not in the House, not in Senate, not as governor, right? All of them are Republicans.
If I could interject on that point, I will say that a lot of the reason for Florida's partisanship is because of the endemic gerrymandering that really features within Florida's apportionment. Because this is a state that until very recently was pretty purple. It was a swing state. It was the swing state, which, as I said, I think now has probably passed on to Georgia.
It's done the Ohio route.
Yeah, it's gone like Ohio. It's turned a lot more red, and the reason for that is because the Republican strategy of focusing on state legislatures has really worked out, and that's allowed them to gerrymander and redistrict in such a way.
Is that fair?
I mean, I don't know. That's a very complicated question, but I think in Florida right now, calling it a swing state would be inaccurate as of now. And I agree with Mateo that has moved to Georgia, most probably. And I would say that I also agree with the fact that the Republicans were very successful in, their strategy targeting, governors in these states. For example, we've seen DeSantis in Florida, and as you mentioned, Ohio also going down that more red route, especially this year with J.D. Vance, who has had a very successful campaign, as opposed to what many people thought 2 weeks ago.
And even Brian Kemp in Georgia has far outperformed the Senate candidate, which has then gone to the Ralph. Either of Maggie and Kieran, I'm interested if you talk to less political people back home. Does DeSantis cut through for them? Are people in Colorado and New York thinking about DeSantis because he's being touted as this Republican savior for 2024? Is this just us reading too much and being really weird nerds?
Well, yes, but
in my county, it's very red where I grew up and where I live. But so a lot of people in Douglas County, where I live, are very much looking at DeSantis as the next presidential candidate for the Republican Party, because there's really, really like adamant support for Trumpism and like those type of policies where I live. So I would say in Colorado, if my county is representative of more Republican counties there, I would say yes.
Yeah, I'd agree that he has national name recognition at this point.
Mm-hmm. Would he beat Trump out in a primary?
No chance. In 2024, I still think there's no chance of that happening. I personally am a huge fan of DeSantis. I would say now I do prefer him over Trump.
Why?
I always like to label DeSantis as a younger and smarter version of Trump. So, as I was saying earlier, he knows when to speak and he knows when not to speak and what not to say, as opposed to Trump, who just literally says or tweets whatever he thinks with no filter whatsoever, which is a blessing and a curse. But in terms of ideology, they're both incredibly similar. I mean, DeSantis is a Trumpist, right, in terms of policies. But in terms of character, he's incredibly different, which I think is way better. But I still think that Trump still holds a huge majority in the Republican Party that wouldn't let DeSantis win.
Yeah, I would like to give one of our panel members here some credit, because on the 8th of May, Matteo published an article through us at Raw, which you can find on our website, which said, essentially gave a rundown of DeSantis' policies, his history.
You're welcome, Vinton.
Yeah, read more on our website. He said, with the election set for November, barring major scandals, DeSantis seems set for a second term. Despite his Trumpian credentials, the two are close, with DeSantis often touting his ties to the former president. It's possible that DeSantis harbours ambitions for 2024. So far, he's excluded the possibility of a run for the White House, but as his visibility increases and his popularity among conservatives skyrockets, those calls may become harder to avoid. Mateo, would you like a round of applause or a pat on the back?
Well, neither, because it's Ron DeSantis we're talking about. So as much as I, think that his come up was foreseeable, he's a smarter version of Trump. He's a more polished version of Trump, but
More
in terms
dangerous?
of, yeah, that's where I was going with that. I think in terms of policy, it's the same thing, and he is more dangerous. I think that it comes down to whether the Republicans choose to stick with Trump or go with DeSantis as to what happens in 2024. Because I think that DeSantis is capable of really restoring some kind of appeal to the Republican cause, and that's also because he doesn't really have the same amount of personal baggage nationally that Trump does. I think that when you look into DeSantis' policies in Florida, you do definitely recognize that he is a culture warrior, and that is central to who he is. And so he's still a very toxic and inflammatory politician. But on the national scale, I think that he doesn't really... Trump's credentials are mostly associated with, January 6th, and a kind of very explicit rebuke of American democracy. And that's not really something that we associate with DeSantis yet. And so I think that he is more presentable, and he's probably more able than Trump at kind of avoiding these uncomfortable questions and situations that would definitely arise when people start to scrutinize his record in Florida.
Yeah, thank you. We're just nearly at the end of our discussion now, but Maggie, looking forward to 2024, are you counting Florida in the column of Texas now as a lost cause? Have the Republicans already got 68 electoral seats when you just look at Florida and Texas alone, or is it still viable?
Oh gosh, I'm almost tempted to say that Texas is more viable than Florida in this moment.
Patrick's nodding, yeah?
Patrick agrees with me. That's
Why?
good. Just because obviously we've got Rubio and DeSantis. They're sort of stranglehold on Florida politics. People were talking about Texas going blue in 2020. They were silly, but there are really changing demographics. Texas is increasingly urban, increasingly diverse.
Migration from Cali.
Exactly. So I think
Mateo, you giving up on Florida?
Yeah. Just put very briefly, yeah. I think that I look at swing counties within Florida as well. I think back to probably 2016, 2012, 2008 even. I think Pinellas County was probably the most important county within, it was a bellwether county really within Florida. And though it was generally purple within the preceding decades, I think within the last few years we've seen it swing red really decisively. I think it went Trump by 7 points last time round, and it went red again in the midterms now. And I think that that's really emblematic of where Florida's going. I mean, it's a solid red state. I don't think you can really call it a swing state anymore.
Yeah. It looks likely, at the very least, that the House is going to be firmly Republican. Kieran, there's going to be bipartisanship in Washington in general, at least for the next 2 years. What does this mean for the two parties looking at 2024? If they've got 2 years of little legislative push forward, does this help the Democrats say we need to get these people out, look what Biden did the first 2 years? Or is this Republicans' chance to say we're holding up all these terrible things coming from the White House, thank us, and put a Republican in 2024?
Well, I think it gives them both the room to say both of those things. I think there will be political gridlock from here going forward, since it is such a narrow, split of seats. But I think because of this, Democrats can look at Biden's record for the last 2 years and say, well, here's what he's done, and here's
as Maggie did at the start.
Exactly.
And then I forgot half the things he's done, which kind of tells you something. But I remembered another one was the first gun reform in 20 years.
Yeah. Student loans as well.
Student loans.
Even though Texas judge today, he's now struck that down, so that's probably going to go through.
Killed it.
Well, it's probably going to get appealed, so it might end up in the Supreme Court. So that's going to be fun.
That'll for sure go the Democrats' way, though.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Cynic. Wow. And finally, just from all of you, who do you think the two nominees were for? As we asked Ben and Emma, who do you think the two nominees are going to be for the two parties? Patrick?
Trump and Biden. I think...
No, Karen.
I think it's going to be a recall of the 2020 election.
And
Most likely going red this time, I think. But I think Biden will do everything he can to run. He's not going to let anyone run because, from what I've seen and many other people have seen, Biden has, or he's trying to, although kind of failing, to become a Trump of the Democrats.
Wow. Is he not too old for that?
I would say so.
Yeah. Mateo, two candidates?
It's complicated because it's American politics, so it's pretty dysfunctional. I think in any other country, both parties wouldn't exist. They'd have splinter parties that really represent what each party is about. But I think I see Biden running because I think that throughout his political career, you can really see that he's always really seen the White House as the culmination of his...
Has he not done that now? He's not ticked that box?
But he wants the second term, I think. I mean, this is someone who's been in government since, I don't know, the 70s?
Long.
And so he's been vice president for 2 terms. I think he, in some ways, probably views it as his right. It's his moment. And nobody really should spoil that for him, at least from where he's sat. I think he will run. And I think that when he chooses to do so, Democrats are going to have to go with it because I don't think they can afford to splinter now.
So who wins?
Well, that's the thing. I think that depends on who the Republicans go with. I think that Trump is... I hesitate to say, again, because it's America, I hesitate to say that he's unrunnable, but if there's anything that the last 3 elections have shown us is that Trump's credibility, the appeal that he has, is not what it was in 2016. And so I say that if it is Trump, I could see Democrats winning. However, it also depends on what the economy looks like by 2024.
If it's DeSantis Biden 2024, which colour?
Again, I think that it just depends on how the economy looks like by 2024. Finton, let me
done
avoid
that?
the question. Let me avoid the question.
Yeah. Kieran, who do you think it's going to be, and which way will it go?
I think I agree that it'll probably be Biden. I guess Biden-Trump, but I mean, I don't know who would win. I don't think Biden should run again, but I think that's what it's going to be.
Red, blue. Come on.
I think I really could go either way. I don't think people will turn out as much to vote for Biden, so I think red.
Thank you, Maggie.
Biden, DeSantis, and it's blue.
Biden, DeSantis, and it's blue.
Yeah.
We've had 6 predictions, 5.5 predictions.
Right, I'll just give mine. Yeah, if it's DeSantis, given the current state of the economy and assuming that Republicans, that the fact that they haven't really contested elections is enough to kind of subvert the democracy narrative, then yeah, I guess DeSantis.
And who winning against Biden?
DeSantis.
DeSantis.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. We've had 6 predictions here today, and hopefully one of them will be right. And tune in again in 2024 to
Hopefully
find out
not.
who won the competition. Thank you all for listening, and
Thanks,
thanks to
Ben.
all of our
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Tune in next time, Mainstream Media.